Because of tonight's live coverage of the Winter Gala from the Royal Opera House, here now on BBC Two, later than planned, tonight's Newsnight with Peter Snow.
The government presents its new package for the old, the sick and the needy. But can it be fair to them and at the same time attempt to slash social security spending? Good evening. The Social Security Secretary said the welfare state would be strengthened by the benefit changes he announced to the Commons today. But how far does his package satisfy two aims of government policy, which sometimes risk being in conflict with each other? Increasing care for those who need it, and cutting what the government regards as the crippling cost of Social Security. Peter Lilly is with us to justify his approach to Labour's Donald Dewar and the Liberal Democrats' Don Foster. And how are those on benefit reacting to the detailed plans for compensation for that extra tax on fuel? Also tonight, Albert Reynolds, the Irish Prime Minister, tells his Parliament that Friday's summit will now be just a working meeting. And then he goes on to say that he wants Mr Major's agreement to the principle of self-determination in both parts of Ireland. How do Michael Mates and a leading backbencher in the Irish Dáil react to that? We also heard today that after an approach from Dublin, President Clinton had been on the phone to Mr Major. We'll be looking at the pressure from the Irish-American lobby for the Clinton administration to be far more interventionist, should the talks falter. Peter Lilly presides over a budget that consumes no less than 1/3 of all government spending, Social Security. Less than a fortnight ago, he set the cat among the pigeons by talking of what he called a future welfare society, in which there'd be an increasing share of provision by individuals, families and companies, rather than by the state. Today, Mr Lilly outlined to the Commons some of the first fruits of the review he's been conducting into Social Security when he fleshed out the measures the Chancellor headlined in yesterday's budget. Far from declaring war on the welfare state, Mr Lilly boasted that his budget was going up.
This is the largest increase of any department and demonstrates our commitment to the needy, the elderly, sick and disabled people.
A quite different emphasis, that, from the Chancellor's yesterday. He did declare war on the growth in Social Security spending.
Social Security spending is increasing at an underlying rate of more than 3% a year in real terms, well above the sustainable growth rate of the economy as a whole. If this trend continues, it will place a quite impossible burden on the working population in the future, our children and our children's children. If we don't plan the Social Security programme properly, we'll be unable to give effective help to those who need it most.
But Mr Clarke's spending plans don't match his rhetoric. Social Security spending rises from £80 billion this year to 83 next, then 88.4 billion, and then 92.4 billion 3 years from now. That's a real drop of just over 1% next year, but beyond that, real increases, over and above inflation, of 2% a year.
We have the government saying that it's committed to getting Social Security spending down as a share of national income. There's not much evidence here. We're seeing Social Security going up. If they're really to cut Social Security, they need to come up with the sort of structural changes that they talk about but haven't yet actually defined.
It far exceeds what most people expected.
Well, today, Mr Lilly told the Commons how he was going, as he put it, to make the welfare state more modern and affordable. Sickness benefit, he said, needed fundamental reform. He said big companies would begin to take over the responsibility for sickness pay from the state.
That is correct.
He said he was to simplify the payment and management of unemployment benefit. A new job seekers allowance would replace it, and cover would be reduced from 12 to 6 months from April 1996.
Our suspicion, and I think many people will share them, is that the ringing cry, "It's time for reform," when it comes from the right honourable gentleman, can be roughly translated into "it's time for a cut." And the people who will suffer are those who are at risk and who are looking for work in the job market.
Invalidity benefit, said Mr Lilly, was now claimed by 3 times as many people as 15 years ago. There'd be a new, tougher medical test, and from April 1995, all newcomers to it would pay tax on it. And on pensions, Mr. Lilly confirmed the Chancellor's announcement yesterday that women and men would be treated equally with the same retirement age of 65 as from the year 2020. But all this won't put more than a dent in that huge budget of his.
Even though the nation has been
So if he does want to save money, what reform should Mr. Lilly be embarking on? There's no shortage of ideas among those who've been advising him in the past few weeks.
I don't think you will ever see a single reform of social security bill. I think it's far too complex and too large to be susceptible of such treatment. What I think you will see is the reform programme by programme, as Peter Lilly put it in the Commons. The systematic look at every single programme, trying to bring it in line with modern needs, trying to bring the whole thing under control.
Well, tomorrow the Environment Secretary will follow up Mr. Lilly by breaking it to local authorities just how much cash they can count on from central government over the coming year. They already complain that they've had to hack back local services. And Mark Easton has been to the heart of the East Midlands to see how people there face up to the challenge of relying less on public provision and more on themselves.
If the people here will ever forgive me, Ilkeston is in many ways any town. Like so many places in Britain, it was based on heavy industry, in this case coal and steel. Today it relies on light industrial and service companies. They say it's a town of two halves, with posh bits and poor bits side by side. So, on the day after central government set out its budget, and the day before local government learns its spending limits, we've come here to ask the townsfolk of Ilkeston whether they think Britain is right to try and reduce the role of the state in the lives of ordinary people. It was the Elderly's Luncheon Club Day today at the Ilkeston Council for Voluntary Services, and the man hosting it all was probably the oldest there. At 87, Ernie Symes, MBE, describes himself as a phenomenon. He has devoted his life to voluntary work, setting up a scout troop between the wars, a highly successful youth club in 1942, and one of the first ever disabled clubs in 1957. He believes that Britain needs to support and expand its voluntary sector. There is, he says, no shortage of people wanting to do their bit. Bang next door to the volunteers' headquarters is the local HQ for the state's social service provision in Ilkeston. Among other things, this is where people come for advice on what benefits they can claim. As a welfare rights officer, Boxshaw Johal sees her duty as ensuring that people don't miss out on their entitlements. Far from reducing the role of the state in providing welfare, she believes it should spend more money. As finance director, Carl Francis is in charge of the money for one of Ilkeston's largest employers. 1,200 people work at Charnos plc, making underwear and knitwear. Mr. Francis, an American, came to Britain 5 years ago, since when he's come to believe that the UK still puts too much emphasis on state rather than individual responsibility. As far as the responsibility of local government is concerned, Ilkeston has already witnessed a big reduction. In the last 2 years, Derbyshire County Council's chief executive, Paul Raine, has had to cut £50 million from council spending. This year, 1,000 council employees were made redundant. As for next, well, tomorrow Mr. Raine will open a sealed envelope to find out how deep the cuts will be. Well, the four people you've just seen are with me all together here in the Mayor's Parlour at Ilkeston Town Hall. John Raine, if I could start with you. Tomorrow you find out just how much money Derbyshire County Council are going to have to spend next year. We suspect a cut of about 2%. Is that kind of reduction significant, do you think, in the wider debate about how much influence the state or local government has in the lives of the people it serves?
Yes, most certainly. When you talk about a 2% cut, we don't know yet. We'll know tomorrow evening. But whatever that cut is that's required of us, you have to consider that that comes on top of successive years of cuts. And so a further reduction tomorrow, whatever the size of that reduction, is going to be extremely painful, extremely difficult to achieve.
Do you think then that the voluntary sector is going to have to pick up more of the kind of services that you're no longer going to be able to provide?
I think there's going to be a greater weight of work and burden put on the voluntary sector. But services are a partnership between the local authority and between the voluntary sector. But bear in mind that over the last 2 years, the County Council, because of grant cuts, has had to significantly reduce the amount of support it can give to the voluntary sector.
Ernie Symes, we saw you in the film, you've devoted a life to this voluntary sector work. Is that right? I mean, are you struggling to keep things going because of cuts from local authorities?
We have been most fortunate and not been subjected to cuts by the local authority, because I believe they understand that the voluntary sector in Ilkeston is doing a really good job of work.
Well, you were telling me you've got volunteers coming out of your ears, queuing up to do it.
So, but the big problem of the volunteers that we have are the ageing population. And we checked on 7 luncheon clubs in the town a few weeks ago, and out of those, the volunteers that are manning the kitchens and the cooking and the washing up are on an average age of 72 years. Some of them over 80, and the youngest 65.
So the young volunteers aren't there?
The young volunteers aren't around. They're not being trained by some reason or other, and government are very fond of saying in their pamphlets and issues and in their speeches that there must be more reliance placed on the voluntary sector, which is a very important contribution to the statutory authorities, but there it ends.
All right, Boxall Joe